Welcome back. We're here for some more objective domain review for the Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate course track, or exam track rather. I've got some slides up. We're going to just go through the same slides we went through in the first module. I'm Christopher Chapman, Content Project Manager, Microsoft Learning, responsible for Microsoft Official Courseware and Microsoft Virtual Academy content for Server and System Center. We're moving on to our second item, which is 70-411 Administering Windows Server 2012. At this point, we're assuming you've got it installed, you've configured some of the basics, DNS, DHCP, Active Directory is installed, you may have a couple of domain controllers. Now we're going to start actually doing some work with those servers. We'll close this because that's pretty much all I need to show you is what we're going to be talking about. I have already pulled up on my screen the same site that we looked at a little while ago, the Microsoft Learning, Microsoft.com/learning. You go into, right on that first page, find an exam, Windows Server, go down to the bottom where it's Windows Server 2012 under the Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate item, and it brings you to the courses that are required and the exams required, 410, 411, and 412. It's how we affectionately refer to them here at Microsoft. And we're on the skills measured section of the exam page for 70-411, Administering Windows Server 2012 R2, or Administering Windows Server 2012. As we mentioned in the first module, the first section, these exams and the courses associated with them do cover R2 and RTM, so Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. The titles do not include R2. We're keeping it sort of a familial exam and course. It's 2012 in all of its glory, whether that's RTM, R2, any future updates, potentially depending on the scope, may include additional information as well. We're going to dive right into this just like we did the 410. Starting at the top, deploy, manage, and maintain servers. We started the last one with configuring and installing servers. We've done that. They're installed, they're up and running. But we may need more. We've done one, we're used to the process, but we may need more servers. We may need more servers more rapidly. We may need something a little bit more reactive or a little bit more agile. So we're going to get into deploy, manage, and maintain servers. This one's kind of nice because it's some very distinct tools that you'll want to familiarize yourself with for this exam. WDS is the first one, Windows Deployment Services. Again, in terms of complexity, given some options that Microsoft provides, a very straightforward tool. You gather images. Those images can be customized using command line tools. You get into much, much, much more granular detail if you start learning about the Windows deployment options, the tools for managing images, the sources for images, for maintaining images, for updating images offline, and that leads you eventually down the path of Configuration Manager, Windows System Center Configuration Manager 2012 R2, which is a phenomenal tool, great tool, not something you're going to have to worry about for the 411. Here, it's WDS, and it's the basics. It's installing images, it's configuring boot options. That's pretty much it. You're not going to get into too much depth on customizing images. I would say know the tools. Know the tools that Microsoft uses for offline image management or just image management in general. Configure and manage boot, install, and discover images. Again, we talked about putting images into WDS so that the clients consuming that service can use those images. Update images with patches, hotfixes, and drivers. I mentioned the offline tools. One of the big ones. Let's one more time go to Bing, DISM, or DISM. We'll wait for it to come up, shouldn't take too long. And there's your result. Right at the top, Deployment, Image Servicing, and Management is the name of the tool. Here we're looking at a technical reference. This is Windows 7. DISM is installed with Windows 7. There are options for this. There should be for Windows 8. Let me go back into that. Here it talks about Windows 8, the Windows deployment with the Windows ADK Automated Deployment Kit, or Assessment and Deployment Kit, I'm sorry. This kit is going to be a suite of tools. And if you look down here, tool topics, basic deployments, deployment tools, technical reference, which you can take a look at. The pre-install Windows PE technical reference, the application compatibility toolkit, the user state migration tool, and the volume activation management tool. These are all the tools included in this ADK, the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit. And I did open up the deployment tools technical reference, WinPE, Windows Setup. I just mentioned DISM, SysPrep, System Image Manager. It looks like a lot. It looks overwhelming. For the sake of the 410, you don't need to know all of the details of all of these tools. You need to know what they are. You need to know what they do. You need to know some of the basics of how they do operate, especially with each other. And you'll need to know how they work with WDS or how they complement WDS from the sake of image creation, management, and deployment. Install features for offline images. Again, that's going to be a tool here. DISM, Deployment Image Servicing and Management Technical Reference, which we already opened. It does say Windows 7. The tool is still usable as is. And configure driver groups and packages. I'm trying to walk a tightrope here between minimizing and expanding. You do need to know WDS. You need to know what it does. You need to know the basics of the interface. In fact, I won't show you this right now because I'll have to install it. But let me do this. Let me get this actually installed real quick so that we can take a look at it. It's a worthwhile interface to look at. You'll notice real quick in my demo environment, I have upgraded the server that I was using in the last module to a domain controller. We've got some additional things to look at and consider that require domain controller functionality. Password's changed, logging into the same server. It's the same exact environment we were in, it's just now a domain controller. Server manager is going to come up automatically, which it usually does unless you check that box within the Manage dropdown in the server manager properties to turn that off. It's going to take a minute. This bar at the top that's scrolling, until that's done, I can't actually do anything else. If I click Add Roles and Features, it's going to give me an error message saying that Server Manager is still gathering information. It's responding a little slow, so this may take just a moment. There we go. Roller feature-based, next, and we're going to go right down to the bottom, Windows Deployment Services. Now, some of the things you'll need to know, I'll give you some quick pointers about WDS. I'm installing WDS on a DHCP server. I had DHCP on this server ahead of time. Now, normally, you may or may not have DHCP, DNS, WDS, and Active Directory all on a single computer. Probably not the best method. This is just for demonstration purposes so we can see the interfaces. But there are considerations you're going to want to know about for WDS installed on a DHCP server. That is a very important topic to do a little bit of additional research on prior to this exam. We're going to go ahead and do all of that. And we'll come back to that in a minute. I'm not sure how long it'll take. Patch management, WSUS, depending on how you want to say it. Windows Server Update Services is again another role. This allows for the automated deployment or the managed deployment of patches, hotfixes, and updates across your network infrastructure. Very useful tool. Again, an interface that's not too complicated. There is some finer management to it, but it's, again, learn about WSUS. There are a lot of resources for learning about Windows Server Update Services. The role itself, the console, what it manages, how updates get brought down. There are some of the more advanced topics for WSUS, and it's outlined here. Install and configure the update services role. Configure group policies, which is very basic. That's going to be kind of a step 1 or step 2. Once you've installed it, step 1 is configure group policies. Tell your clients to use WSUS. Configure client-side targeting, which is part of your group policies. Configure synchronization and configure groups. You can have multiple WSUS servers. You have to tell those servers how to get updates from Microsoft. Do you want all of your WSUS servers getting updates from Microsoft? Do you want one getting updates from Microsoft and the others getting their options or their updates from that one in your environment? Saves you on bandwidth, saves you on time. Manage patch management in mixed environments. Again, just the scope of what we're covering in these 3 courses is very broad. There's a lot of information. Don't feel intimidated. So far, WDS by itself, pretty straightforward. WSUS by itself, pretty straightforward. Active Directory is a little bit more complicated. Group policy is a little bit more complicated. DNS, at this level, at the 410 level, relatively straightforward. DHCP as well. Monitoring servers, data collector sets, alerts, real-time performance. This again is going to be a lot of conversation about tools, about task manager, about performance monitor, about event viewer in some cases. Those are all tools you should know. They're tools you should spend some time with, how they work not necessarily with each other, but what they do that does and doesn't overlap. What can I get out of Performance Monitor that I can't get out of Event Viewer? What can I get out of Task Manager that I can't get out of Performance Monitor? There are things that do and don't overlap amongst the three. And these topics, they're very straightforward topics. You're going to be able to find great information on these. Data collector sets, alerts. Monitoring real-time performance is just going to be a discussion of the tools, Performance Monitor and Task Manager. Monitor VMs. There are going to be a lot of resources for monitoring VMs because virtual machines to some degree can be monitored like physical machines. The services and the roles and the features running within that VM can be monitored as if it's a physical machine. However, you may want to monitor the host for virtual machine specific counters. You may want to monitor the VM for its interaction with the host. There are additional considerations. Plus, you may be virtualizing workloads, Exchange, SharePoint, even Active Directory that you're going to want to have special considerations in mind for doing. Monitor events, configure event subscriptions. This is all part, again, of Task Manager, Performance Monitor, Event Viewer. Those are your big three tools. As we've talked about, and as I will continue to reiterate, a hands-on lab inside of a Microsoft official course, you're going to get to actually build out all three of these, WDS, WSUS, and performance monitoring tools. You're going to get to do these labs. You're going to actually get to experience what it looks like, where the check buttons are, or where the check boxes are, where the buttons are, what the options mean. I'm jumping back to my demo environment real quick. We're looking at the WDS deployment, or the WDS installation. That role is installed. Close this, go to Tools. Windows Deployment Services is now an option. All we're going to look at is the console. Servers, I only have one. Not configured, right-click and configure. Integrated with Active Directory, probably your best bet. It doesn't have to be that way though. Enter the path to the remote install folder. This is where images, it says right here, will contain boot, install images, Pixie boot files, and the WDS management tools. It's basically a good storage repository for images. That's the crux of it. Put this somewhere. You're not going to want to put it on your main volume on your C drive. Put this on its own storage. Doesn't necessarily have to be high speed. Doesn't even really necessarily have to be redundant unless you're using highly customized images and this is your only storage location for those images, in which case you're going to want to back it up. Or potentially have highly fault-tolerant drives or highly redundant drives. Those are conversations for inside your network. This gives me a warning. I'm selecting the Windows volume because, again, we're just doing this for the sake of seeing the interface. For best performance and data reliability, the remote installation folder should be stored somewhere else. We don't want to slow down the server by putting what will be a large data store on the same drive as the operating system, and reliability. If we need it to be fault-tolerant, redundant, we may do that somewhere else. This is what I warned about, or what I mentioned earlier. If DHCP is running on the same server as WDS, there are considerations. You're going to want to keep track of both of these, whether it's non-Microsoft or Microsoft, and whether these options are configured. I'm not going to go into great. I want to talk more about this. I've used WDS a lot. I'm very familiar with these options and how to configure them and the finer points to configure them and getting them to work, but it's beyond our scope for today. Pixie server, if we want to be able to network boot computers and have them communicate with Windows Deployment Services and grab images as bare metal computers, we can do that. Respond only to known is perfectly fine. Interesting, it didn't start for some reason. Well, all tasks start. Let's see if it'll actually start. There we go. Started the second time. Can't tell you why it didn't start the first. It was a pretty quick cycle. And now that that's configured, we've got it running. We now have all of our additional options for folders. Install images, which we create. Boot images, which will get added when you do install images. Pending devices. This goes back to the Pixie responder. You can pre-approve devices, basically, or manually approve devices for Pixie boot. Multicast, very good if you want to do large deployments to a large number of clients or servers of the same image. You don't have to send that image via the network to each of those computers individually. You can send out a multicast, which means those computers are basically just listening to a single location. Driver groups, again, we're not going to get into too much detail. This is WDS. Just this interface, you can see it's not terribly complicated. And I say that in the sense that I'm also used to System Center Config Manager, which can be used for deployment of operating systems, which is exponentially more complicated and exponentially more functional if you really want to get into very complex deployment solutions. But for now, for the sake of 411, here it is. This is deployment services. And we're on to the next group, file and print. Now it says file and print in the title, 15 to 20%, but you'll notice the subcategories are mainly file. DFS, file server resource manager, file and disk encryption, and advanced audit policies. They're all file-based technologies, and that's what you're going to need to learn. In 410, we learned shares, we learned NTFS permissions, we learned share permissions, we learned the basics. Here are some files. How do we manage them? How do we manage them? How do we share them out? Now we're going to learn about more complex methods of sharing those files, making those files highly available, potentially sharing those files across geographically diverse or dispersed boundaries, and monitoring our servers that are being used as file servers for resource utilization. DFS is just that, distributed file system. It's a way to share content from multiple servers, potentially across geographic boundaries, in a single space, in a single location. Now, Microsoft uses the term namespaces. As a user, you're going to go into whatever method you use to get to a file share. You're going to type in the name of that file share, which is usually a server followed by a folder, and you're going to get access to your files. A namespace, you're going to type in a single string, a single location, looks much like a URL, and it's going to give you access to files that may not be in your geographic location, that may not be on the same server. It's just a consolidation is what DFS really is. DFS namespaces, replication targets, which servers am I going to sync with? Replication scheduling, when am I going to do that synchronizing? Do I want to impact network traffic during business hours? Remote differential compression settings, this is a method that Microsoft uses within our operating systems to minimize data transfers over a network, depending on what the content is. Staging, fault tolerance, again, we've talked about fault tolerance. Do we want this to be highly available? Clone a database, recover databases. I don't know that some of these, this is another one of those that in the 411 you're going to want to know a fair amount. Yeah, I would say these are all great topics for DFS for the 411 exam. The problem that we have both educating our potential exam takers and the problem you may have as exam takers is we've got a certain number of questions. It's not a massive amount of questions. It's somewhere in the 50 to 100 range, if I remember correctly, the last time I took a test. And we're trying to cover a lot of ground. So what specifically is covered, we're trying to kind of cover in this exam, or in this video, as much as we can of what might be on the test. You may not see all of these topics, but you might. You might see one of these topics. But what I'm trying to do is guide through, hopefully, some of these, telling you what you will and won't need to know at what levels. DFS, these are all good things to know. We are getting a little bit more advanced at this point in the 411 course. So you've gone from simple files and shares to DFS, geographically distributed, potentially redundant storage solutions for file availability. File Server Resource Manager is the next evolution of managing, in this case, one simple example is quotas. It's a further step in quota management beyond just right-clicking the C drive and going to the quotas tab in NTFS. It also comes with other tools. Configure file screens, determining what our users can and can't save. Configuring reports, I want to see what storage is being used and by whom and for what. And file management tasks. So it's just the next evolution. File and disk encryption, we have options for this. We've got EFS, encrypting file system, or encryption file system, where as a user I can encrypt files on my computer. Someone else may or may not, depending on how I've got it configured and what other things I've done, be able to get to those files. Bitlocker is probably going to be something you're more familiar with, or at least may have heard about. It is whole drive encrypted. My laptop right here sitting next to me is protected with Bitlocker. I was going to raise it up. He put the camera back on me so I can show you. Here's my laptop. I don't know if I can show logos or whatnot. Here we go. Let me do this. I'll do that. There's my laptop. This laptop is BitLocker encrypted. So I don't have to worry about that drive being compromised if for some reason I should lose this laptop, which I don't plan on ever doing. Network unlock feature. This is actually a nice feature. I've had instances where my Bitlocker installation thinks it's been compromised. It hasn't actually been compromised, but a restart, a hardware change, some other OS issue that I've had to restart the laptop, and it prompts me for a Bitlocker recovery key. If I have access to my corporate network and my credentials, I can get that key. Again, I'm trying to explain it without going too much into depth. There are lots of great features for Bitlocker that allow users to take care of problems themselves, if they so choose. They have that option. Bitlocker Policies, the EFS recovery agent, which is a conversation for, it's a pretty in-depth conversation. It gets into some certificates. Yeah, I would say EFS recovery is probably important. What an EFS recovery agent is it's a user that you assign the ability to decrypt any encrypted content on any computers that your users have encrypted using EFS. Very powerful tool, very important tool. They do talk in here about managing EFS and Bitlocker certificates. I'm not going to go into great depth. The 4.11, it's minimal. We're not into certificates yet. We get into certificates in 4.12 a lot. Backup and restore those certificates if you need them, especially for that EFS recovery agent. You're going to want to protect those certificates very carefully. Advanced audit policies. So what we have now is, using group policy, the ability to audit files. File access, file usage, file modification. They do talk in here about implementing auditing using group policy, auditpoll.exe, which is a command line tool that interacts with auditing and group policy. Expression-based audit policies, removable device audit policies. This actually I feel like is kind of minimizing. That first one, implementing auditing using group policy, is gigantic. It's a big topic. There's a lot to it in terms of auditing success versus failure, what types of events you audit, and what the results are and where they're stored. Next section, network services and access. So again, this is an evolution. In 4.10, 4.10, we talked about DNS. In 4.11, after we've installed DNS, and we've looked around and seen what it does, now we're going to actually start using it. DNS zones. Creating zones for our internal network, creating additional zones for other networks in our infrastructure. Primary and secondaries and stubs, what do they do? Conditional forwarders, zone and conditional forwarding in Active Directory, zone delegation if we want additional users to be able to manage subsets of our DNS infrastructure, zone transfer settings for primary and secondary DNS servers if we're not using Active Directory integrated, which is something you'll have to learn, is Active Directory integration, and configuring notification settings. It's just more. You may have seen some of these options in the 4.10. I'd mentioned bring up the console, install a test environment, and use it. Get into that management console and check the boxes and play around and see what happens and what things do. This is where you will learn what those boxes do. Again, if you're taking a 5-day course, you're going to sit, you're going to learn, you're going to do. You're going to build primary and secondary zones. You're going to configure stub zones. DNS records, these are what exist within your zones. Resource records, quadruple A, which is an IPv6 mechanism. Pointer records for reverse DNS. SOA or start of authority records. NS is your name servers. SRV records are text records that, well, they define where services are within Active Directory. It's the best explanation I can give you in a short amount of time. CNAME, which is aliases. MX, which is mail servers. All these different types of records you're going to have to learn about, and you will. Configure zone scavenging. How do we clean out old records in DNS? DNS will just grow forever if we let it. Record options, time to live and wait. Round robin is a built-in mechanism for DNS to do high availability, sort of. Configure secure dynamic updates. If we want updates from DNS servers to spread out to other DNS servers, we have options for allowing it to do that without compromising any of the information contained in those DNS zones. Again, evolution. 4.11, more complicated DNS, more configuration relative to real-world scenarios. VPN and routing. I'll lump up these next two together, VPN, routing, and direct access. How to make this simple. VPN and direct access are very important. You're going to want to know VPN for the 4.11 exam. You're going to want to know what direct access does for the 4.11 exam. And right here, server requirements, client config, DNS for direct access, and certificates for direct access. As we've gotten into R2 of Server 2012, even though direct access has been around for a couple of versions now, we're bringing more of that content to the surface in these exams and in our courses. Direct access is a large topic. It's an important topic. It's a very, very valuable technology. I would say walk through, outside of, again, the 5-day course, walk through some of the step-by-steps that we provide. And let me see if I can find one of those really quickly. Direct access step-by-step. So all I did was direct access step, test lab guide, demonstrate direct access. There's also a Geek of All Trades step-by-step direct access installation. These are both TechNet resources. There's also the direct access on TechNet kind of overall technology page. Create a test lab to demonstrate direct access with simulated internet, intranet, and home networks. Step-by-step DA installation, Greg Shields. Build and provision. It's just a good resource. Now it says here, start by provisioning a Windows Server 2008 R2 machine. You should be able to do this in 2012 R2 and get through it. Even if there are differences, they're not going to be global differences that prohibit you from finishing the steps. And then the TechNet page for remote access, Server 2012, 2008 R2. One big difference right here, it talks about direct access. Remote access is the overarching role, DA and routing remote access services into one role. If we scroll down here, I should find in the right version. Now we've got manage out to direct access clients, not really the one I want. Direct access capacity planning is going to be a good one. No, I'm not sure we've got that. Step-by-step might be your best bet. The lab build out or lab test and the step-by-step provided on TechNet for actually building and testing direct access. And it's valuable. You're going to learn translation technologies as part of that. VPN and routing. VPN is very important. You're going to need to learn the protocols available, the configuration options available. I will say from a configuration standpoint, VPN is more complicated or potentially more complicated than direct access in Windows Server 2012 R2. And direct access is more functional, I believe, in terms of ease of use for your users. So I may focus on that. For the sake of the exam, you're going to want to know both. Now we come into a category that I have a sore spot, I guess you could say, about discussing, only because of all of the technologies and all of the breadth and all of the options in Windows Server. Network Policy Server being one that I haven't implemented that much in enterprise environments in the last 15 years. Tends to be one of those that I learn about and then I sort of forget about over time, and I relearn about and I sort of forget about over time. So it's a constant struggle for me to remember all of this. This is great information. The Radius portions, the Network Policy Server, is very, very valuable, especially for the new 21st century enterprises that are rolling out large wireless networks. You want your users to be able to connect to those wireless networks without the necessity of having separate usernames and passwords or separate security configurations for your wireless networks. Radius is the way, or a way, to integrate your wireless devices with your, in this case, Active Directory accounts for the sake of users connecting to wireless without using separate security credentials. NPS policies and network access protection. Very big topics, very great topics. These are ways to prevent computers that are not up to standard from connecting to your network. Those may be home computers. Those may be laptops that, even if they're corporate laptops, my laptop sitting right here on the desk, may not be up to standard if I haven't plugged it into the corporate network in a month, which is entirely possible. Network access protection does that same thing. It validates certain criteria of computers and allows them to connect or not connect to the network. NPS policies are connection requests. This is where you get into your VPNs. More specific control, more enterprise control of your VPN solutions outside of the basic routing and remote infrastructure or routing and remote access services that we talked about in the network services and access. I'm trying to think of anything else I would cover here. Anything in particular? I don't know that I can think of anything in particular. Direct access is, not direct access, I'm sorry. Network Policy Server is something you may see readily if you're building out wireless. The rest of these are going to be sort of an on-demand and as needed solution. But great to know about, very powerful. Again, they're centralizing management options. Active Directory, because we haven't had enough of that yet after my warnings in the 410 with our users and groups and organizational units and configuring all of that information. Now we need more. As an administrator, you may start out just managing users, creating accounts, resetting passwords. As a help desk tech years and years and years ago, I had the job of resetting user account passwords. That was all I did in Active Directory in this particular enterprise. One of my many jobs was Active Directory user password management. Here we're going to get into more complicated Active Directory features, but still within Active Directory domain services. Service accounts and group managed service accounts, very important topics. I would say spend some good time on those two topics. They're very useful in an enterprise in the real world. They're also covered very well by our materials. They're in the courses, they're in the exams. Configure Kerberos Delegation. It's good to know, it's good to understand. I would definitely have that. Kerberos Delegation is one of those that you may or may not get a lot of in the real world depending on your role, and if you're managing applications that require Kerberos Delegation. SPN, Service Principal Names, and virtual accounts. This is one of the rare arenas of Active Directory that does get a little complicated because a lot of these topics are new. Service accounts were new in 2008. Group managed service accounts were new in 2012. Kerberos Delegation has existed. That's been around for a long time. Service principal names, just as a concept, are complicated because you're talking about essentially a user not authenticating as a user or a service not authenticating as itself. Domain controllers. I sigh heavily at domain controllers. Just like our first conversation in 410 about users and groups and organizational units, domain controllers are a large topic. If you're going to be managing an Active Directory domain, you want to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort on domain controllers. The topics we put here, transfer and seize operations master roles, you're going to want to know what those roles are. You're going to want to know what they do. You're going to want to know how to transfer and seize them and what the tools are available. Install and configure a read-only domain controller. I can say that one hasn't been a huge topic of interest for students that I've worked with or other people in technology that are helping us with some of our courseware or just working in technological environments. It is a great option. It's something to know about. It's another one of those options that's relatively small in terms of scope. You're not going to be spending weeks and weeks and weeks learning about read-only domain controllers. So it's good to learn. And domain controller cloning. This is a good one if you want to, I hesitate to say, make images and virtualize. There's still some controversy with people that I know and that I talk to that I'm trying to sway on virtualizing domain controllers, but it's an option that is available. Maintaining Active Directory, this is just maintenance. It starts right at the top. Backup Active Directory and sysvol. Manage it offline. One of the new features in Windows Server 2008, I believe it was R2, but I can't remember that specifically, was the ability to stop the Active Directory domain services task or service in Windows and essentially manipulate AD offline. Optimize the database, clean up metadata, configure snapshots, object and container level recovery. We now have a recycle bin in Active Directory. Perform a restore, configure and restore objects using the recycle bin we just talked about. It's all terrific information. It's all things you should know both for the enterprise and for the exam. So Active Directory maintenance is very important. I think that's all I have to say about that one. Configure account policies. We did learn about this a little bit in 410. They talked about some of the basic policies within group policy. Here we're getting a little more real world, a little bit more real time. Domain and local user password policy settings, password settings objects, which are the brief introduction, a way to apply password policies to individuals, or at least on a smaller scale than your entire domain, which is the most narrow you can get pre-PSOs. You could only apply password policies to an entire domain. Delegate password settings management for those users that you've got who's maybe work on the help desk and their job is to reset passwords. Configure account lockout policy settings. How many times can I try to put in my password before I can't try anymore, before Windows tells me I'm done and I have to wait? This one's going faster than I expected. I'm not sure if we have much else to cover. Group policy. I mean, I could talk about this for hours because, again, we're talking about group policy, and it is one of the biggest features in all of Windows for everything that it does. Configure processing. In 4.10, we talked a little bit about creating GPOs. Create a policy that says that user X can't do something. And it just sits there. You can create it without actually implementing it, without connecting it to anything. However, once you've got a number of those GPOs or group policy objects built, you're going to want to connect them to things. How you do that matters. And that's what this addresses. Configure processing order and precedence. I can configure multiple group policy objects to apply to the same container, the same OU, the same domain. How they are applied if the settings overlap is determined by processing order and precedence. Blocking of inheritance and enforced policies, we get into almost a cyclical arena of I create a policy, I apply that policy to a domain, but I block that policy being inherited to a given organizational unit in that domain. So it applies to everyone except this one organizational unit. But then I can configure an enforced policy at the top that says this policy wins even if somebody's got inheritance blocked. Like I said, it's kind of a chicken or the egg first sort of a conversation. Who's blocking, who's inheriting, which blocking is overriding inheriting, and which way is not. Security filtering and WMI filtering, ways to apply policies more specifically and in a more granular fashion. Loopback processing, ways to test your policies. Configure and manage slow link processing and group policy caching and client-side extensions. This is if you're going to have group policies applied to branch offices that may be across slow WAN links, and you don't necessarily want to use up that traffic. Or you can't. You don't have the ability of those computers to ping for group policy every 90 minutes, which is the default refresh period. Force group policy update. Once you've made a change to group policy, you want to apply it to this laptop right now. It's important that it happens now. There are ways to do that instead of waiting for the next automatic refresh. Configure group policy settings. I hesitate, I stop. That one stops me in my tracks because what they're talking about here, settings, software installation, folder redirection, scripts, administrative templates, you're now into the thick of group policy. You're going to spend hours, days, weeks of your life on group policy. And it's not unusual, it's not unexpected. Know ahead of time, as soon as you get to this level, as soon as you get to 4.11 and you're looking at group policy, it's time, it's depth, it's hopefully for you an environment where you can play around enough to see what they really do, have enough computers and enough user accounts, hopefully not in a production environment, that you can make changes to group policy that are tangible, that you can see things changing with your user accounts and your computers. So it's big. It's big and it's complicated. Manage GPOs. This kind of relates to the top when we talked about manage group policy or configure group policy processing. Managing GPOs is kind of part of that same category, backing them up, importing them, copying, restoring them. I can create an entire host of GPOs in a test environment. Make sure they work the way I want them to work, and then just move them to my production environment. I don't have to recreate them. Create and configure migration table, reset default GPOs, and delegate group policy management if we want other people to manage group policy. At this point, step 1 and step 2, especially step 2, the configure policy processing and configure group policy settings are going to keep you busy for a good long time. And then group policy preferences at the bottom. There are additional settings in group policy now that didn't used to be there that will configure more finite things on client computers and potentially on servers. I struggle right now because I want to talk more. I love group policies. I love Active Directory. I want to talk more tech. I want to get into the depths. But we're here today just to review the OD. We're here for you guys to know, you guys and gals, to learn what's covered, what's to be expected, where you should know a lot and where you shouldn't. As I mentioned here, configure and manage Active Directory, you're going to want knowledge. You're going to want hands-on in a perfect world, whether that's working with cohorts in your current organization or sitting down in a classroom for 5 days with an instructor and some Microsoft courseware, learning about Active Directory, learning about group policy, spending some time, getting some hands-on. Some of this is just a matter of knowing what's on the exam, what to study for, regardless of the method you're using, whether it's a book or a course or Microsoft Virtual Academy. So I think, once again, down here at the bottom, instructor-led training, 20411B and C. I'm not sure why they're both here. There should only be one. Exam prep videos, we have one of these. Self-paced training, we're now looking again at Microsoft Virtual Academy. Windows Server 2012 Jumpstart, preparing for the data center evolution. Practice tests, again, we talked about these vendors in the last course, Kaplan, MeasureUp, and Transcender. From the community is the Born to Learn forum, may or may not be useful for you. And at the end, our books, Administering Windows Server 2012 Training Guide. Microsoft Press has a whole series for the MCSA track. That takes care of 70411. I'm just now realizing as I'm talking about this, I don't have any means of anybody to contact me. So before I'm done with this course, I'll let you know now, jump to the beginning of the third module, which will be 412. I'll make sure my contact information is both at the beginning of the third and at the end of the entire series, so at the end of the third as well. So you'll have an email address to get in touch with me. I can't promise I'll respond in a timely manner. I've got a lot going on. I'm very busy here working on projects, but I will try and respond, or at least get somebody who can, depending on what your questions are related to exams or courses. I think that's it for 411, so we're going to take a brief break. You can take a brief break as well before you start that next video, and we will we'll be right back to give you some more information on 70412. Thank you for watching so far.